of history was Engels calls his account dialectical materialism. Materialism because Marx took a materialist account of our condition. In other words, if you want to understand why things hash out the way they do, you have to first understand that we are physical beings with material needs. First and foremost, our needs are material ones. We are in a material competition in order to survive. Now, dialectical, he borrows this idea, history is dialectic, from what philosopher? He borrows this idea. Hegel, yes. Hegel was also a German, a major philosopher of the early 19th century. This idea that history unfolds dialectically suggests that each epoch of history, or era or period of history, is governed by an overarching historical thesis. Now, for Hegel, each historical thesis was a historical concept or idea. Now, according to Marx, each historical thesis is one about the material conditions of labor. For example, prior to our phase of history was this agrarian feudal stage. In the feudal stage, most of the labor was agricultural. And that was because of the technologies of production, because they hadn't advanced to the point beyond what I would call mostly subsistence. Power was held in the hands of nobles and their minions. What gave nobles the right to rule? The brute answer was force. They had power on their side. They also used historical ideas to convince the masses to accept rule by the nobility. Now, it turns out that as the forces of history unfold, each thesis will bring forth an antithesis. Now, the antithesis will refer to historical forces that are diametrically what? Opposed to the thesis. You might call these forces contradictions. Contradictions lead to conflict. Conflict that will resolve in a what? What Hegel called a synthesis, which would become the new historical thesis. Now, according to Hegel, this is not Marx, history was the physical and temporal unfolding of the mind of God, the divine mind. Now, Marx did not agree with Hegel on that. Marx was a what? The text doesn't make him... Yeah, he was an atheist and he was a materialist. He saw physical material forces as the main drivers of history.
You got that from Friedrich or something?
He got that from a bunch of people.
Okay.
Yeah, his atheism actually goes all the way back to his reading the ancient Greeks. The atomists, actually. Now, yeah, his theses, he's referring to his theses on Feuerbach, by the way. Feuerbach was also an atheist, by the way, who also saw the unfolding of history as being a brute material struggle. Now, there's a famous line from his theses on Feuerbach. This is that line that others have tried to interpret history. The point is to what? The point is to change it. Marx's philosophy will be one that will, historically speaking, will inspire what we might call revolutionary struggle against oppression. He believed that the struggle against oppression was what? He believed that it was historically inevitable. In other words, systems that have internal contradictions or lead to their own contradictions are ultimately doomed to failure at one point or another. It just sometimes takes longer than at other times. Marx predicted that in the end, laissez-faire capitalism would fail. And his account for explaining history is called the historical dialectic or dialectical materialism. Now, according to Marx, the ideas and institutions compatible with the economic base of society constitute its superstructure. Now, ladies and gentlemen, some of these ideas in Marx that you will encounter, you might also encounter in what other kind of a course? I'm not thinking history, although that too.
Economics.
Yeah, economics, or I was going to say sociology. A major theme that you will likely learn about in an Intro to Soc course is something called conflict theory. The ideas behind conflict theory come straight out of Karl Marx. Matter of fact, conflict theory is an idea derived from his notion of history as dialectic. The idea that the forces, the material forces, will bring forth contradictions that will lead to conflict and ultimately resolution. Now, talking about the economic structure in terms of the economic base or the substructure, and then the institutions that arise out of it, the superstructure, these are also terms that you might hear in an economics or a sociology class. Now, when we talk about the economic base or the substructure of society, we are talking about the means and the modes of production. The means and the modes of production refer to things like the kind of raw materials available, the kinds of technologies of production, and of course, the workforce. The substructure constitutes the material base. That's another way of putting it. It constitutes what we would call the material facts underlying the structure of society. Now, the superstructure refers to the ideas. And folks, where do ideas exist? Just to reiterate this. Ideas are things that exist in minds. Ideas are powerful things because they shape the way we interpret reality. They shape the way we look at our conditions. They shape the way that we're likely to react or fail to react to our conditions. Marx understood that while each historical thesis was not an idea, it was about material forces. Marx understood that the ideas have a lot to do with societal change or lack thereof. But the superstructure refers to the ideas and the institutions that arise out of and are consistent with the substructure. Now, folks, it did not surprise Karl Marx that the kinds of ideas and institutions that will arise out of the ideas and institutions that will arise out of a laissez-faire economic system will be ideas and institutions that will support which group of society. And by the way, folks, I'll give you a little Marx truism here. The ideas and institutions that will arise in every epoch of human history will be those that favor the oppressor class. And this is because the oppressors will be in a position to not just have material control, but through their material control, they will also be able to wrestle power over the way people think. They will also take control of the ideas and institutions. So unsurprisingly, the kinds of ideas and institutions that will arise out of a laissez-faire capitalist system will be those that are supported by the bourgeoisie. The kinds of ideas and institutions that are supported by the bourgeoisie and bourgeois control over the system will emerge out of a laissez-faire capitalist economic system. And to put it to you this way, Marx's discussion of the superstructure already explains how and why co-option is likely to happen. Co-option, ladies and gentlemen, occurs when the oppressed are deceived or seduced into accepting the idea systems of their oppressors. Now, some examples of that in our system might be the fact that most of us are taught to believe that even when our economic system isn't working very well, it's still the best one that has ever existed in human history. And even if you don't like it, even if you are a loser in it, you should probably look in the mirror. Because remember, we're taught if you are a success, it must be because you're smarter, you work harder, whatever. That's the ideology of, what is it? The Protestant work ethic, as we call it. He who works the hardest will always necessarily reap the rewards. And if you work hard and you just didn't succeed, it's just because you're a dummy and you didn't go out and be an entrepreneur, that kind of thing. We're also taught that our system rewards innovators, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Do we have time for a 2 to 5 minute offshoot?
Depends. Go for it.
Okay, so I think we should look in the mirror for our failure within the capitalist economy, but not because of specific work within one individual job or even within our own lives. I think we have to take a look at poor voter participation and the fact that we're not actually structuring the capitalist society in such a way that it will help everyone.
Well, just to piggyback off of that, notice that we don't have a pure capitalist economic system anyway, although we're always told what? We're always told that this is a capitalist system. Now, the reason why it's not a pure capitalist system is because laissez-faire capitalism has never even what? It has never actually existed. It was an ideal model that Adam Smith speaks about. Laissez-faire literally means what?
Hands off.
Hands off. It means absolutely zero government intervention. Now, the problem with that is what? As long as you have a government, there will be what? There will be intervention in some way or another. Now, this is the way the laissez-faire capitalists explain that away, though. They will say, the less government interference, the what? The better. In other words, they will argue for a kind of radical libertarianism where the government will only minimally intervene in the economy. Now, since you offshoot, I'll offshoot for a minute. The irony of this is the very same people who talk for limited to no government intervention in the economy seem to be inconsistent because they almost never have a problem with what? Basically not holding corporations to pay what opponents call their what?
Fair share.
Their fair share. Not having a big problem with those of us at the bottom of the food chain paying all kinds of taxes for every single little thing we do. But they're always wanting to reduce corporate tax rates. And of course they will say it's because corporations are the job creators. You people are dependent upon them, you leeches. In other words, the working class, how many of you know what I'm talking about? The working class is implicitly told that we are the leeches on the captains of industry. That is the rhetoric that we heard out of the 2012 election. Remember when Mitt Romney said, pretty much if you are a worker, you are leeching off of the corporate people who actually built this economy? Forgetting that what? That corporations are dependent upon workers too. And corporations, remember, if a worker screws up economically and takes out a mortgage she can't afford, what happens to the average Joe six-pack?
Bankrupt, destroyed credit.
Yeah, they will basically rip the shirt off your back if they can get away with it. But if a corporation runs its business badly, here in America, it gets what?
Bailout.
It gets a bailout. No, we now call it economic stimulus. But yeah, the corporation gets a bailout. And with that bailout money, it does not trickle down to the workers. A lot of that bailout money, and you saw this happen with AIG and a whole bunch of other corporations who had big scandals, they gave big bonuses to the upper management. Meanwhile, they were cutting worker jobs. Now, by the way, folks, upper management is technically not the bourgeoisie either. They are the agents of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are people you typically never see or hear from. They are nameless, faceless. As a matter of fact, at this point, we might call corporations themselves the bourgeoisie. Because they tend to do what? They tend to be able to buy as much influence as they want. Koch brothers. They tend to be able to buy as much influence as they want. They tend to be able to get policy written in their interests. They also tend to be very good at making political commercials that will influence the average Joe working class person to actually vote against their interests. Of course, the most effective thing over the last 15 years has been the emergence of what is called tribalism. We want to keep the working class fighting amongst itself. And this is like a line right out of John Sayles' Matewan. They want to keep the race war alive. Because when the white and black working classes don't identify themselves as fellow members of the working class, we will make the issues in society social ones rather than economic ones. In other words, the American people, this is my example of co-option, the American people are literally playing right into what Marx would call their enemy's hands. They're playing right into their enemy's hands. By the way, so-called values voters, by the way, everyone's technically a value voter, but so-called value voters do this also. They focus on what are called political wedge issues that really don't affect the bottom line. When I say the bottom line, I'm talking about what? Economics. What people might call economic justice. When people are getting all lathered up about protesting the national anthem, the powers that be love that because it's getting people riled up over little things that keep them distracted from what some of us would call systematic injustices. When people are getting all lathered up over the abortion issue, yes, I want to make sure every single baby is born. You know, that kind of talk. Or I want to make sure that my gun rights are protected because they're the most important rights. When people are focused on these kinds of issues, the Koch brothers love it. They love it. Because these are people distracted from the issues that might lead to people, what does my daughter call it? Getting woke? Is that what, do the kids still say stuff like that? You know, waking up. Seeing reality brutally for what it is. And then saying, I won't play this game anymore. I've been lied to all my life. Buying into these kind of things will just keep me where? Keep me down underneath the Koch brothers' boots. I'm using these names to make it very contemporary. Yeah, to wake up and say, we won't play this game anymore. Now, of course, there's plenty of ways to keep people playing the game, and one of them is the grass is always greener over here mythology. You know what I mean by the grass is always greener in America? Even if our healthcare system sucks, it's way better than Canada, where people are just dying left and right. By the way, that's not what? That's not true. We get a lot of misrepresentations about other countries' healthcare systems. Now, who wants to maintain the status quo? It's called big insurance and big pharma. Because the money's rolling in. And by the way, once the big pharma and big insurance got Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, rewritten to its liking, you notice they stopped opposing it. And this is because guess what they had out of the Affordable Care Act? They had the promise, pretty much, that the system wouldn't become too socialist. In other words, they wouldn't be cut out of the game. That's why I laughed when my wife's stepdad called Obamacare a socialist plan to destroy the medical system. Like, socialist? If it were socialist, we wouldn't be still keeping who in the mix? Yeah, there would no longer be insurance companies deciding if they're going to deny me health care or not. Now, keep in mind that even our conversation about socialism is a form of co-option. Keeping the people ignorant about economics is part of the system. You know what I'm talking about? How do we keep people ignorant about economics and sociology? Well, we only teach them in the high schools when what? When our daughters are taking AP classes. In other words, less than 10% of the students are getting any kind of meaningful background in this kind of stuff. You can't know what to fight back against if you don't know what's going on. Or what was that, I don't remember. I gotta know this. If you don't know which way the wind blows, was it a brain gastrointestinal problem? What's his name? Bob Dylan, of course. What's wrong with me, man? Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, you first got to, if you're taught the wind blows in the direction it's not blowing in, it's no wonder you don't know who to fight against. It's no wonder you don't know who to fight against. These are just some contemporary things that Marx would call, offshoots of co-option. Yeah.
I would argue that the figure is actually less than 10% because they don't learn applied economics or applied history. They learn memorization BS.
Oh, I just pulled that. I just made that stat out of my butt. That was as a high-end number. Because the fact is, all I was trying to get at was the idea is that relatively few people get through the secondary school system prepared, and then very few people take any kind of critical courses like this when they come to college, for one reason or another. Mainly because they're not required courses, and now we have this new move the STEM move, and I'm not as opposed to the STEM movement as some of my friends in the humanities are. But the idea that you should only take classes that will let you fit into a specific job, that tells me that the aim of society is not to make education about well-rounding a human being, but about making you a nice cog to be able to fit into a job somewhere.
Which connects to Marx's idea of alienation.
Yeah. Turning you people into a cog is one way of keeping you in your place. Now, since he mentioned this, he's driving